For nearly 50 years, Roe v. Wade protected the right to abortion nationwide, but it was overturned in 2022. And the issue is now highly prominent in the presidential campaign. It's on the ballot in many states around the country. And the situation after Roe was overturned is a checkerboard across 50 states where some states allow abortion and have strict protections for it. In other states, it is almost impossible, in some cases, completely outlawed. We're going to take a look at that today. We have on the agenda to look at the way in which the abortion issue is on the ballot, and it's discussed by both Democrats and Republicans. Democrats are touting their support for abortion rights. How effective can they be in protecting that right? Republicans largely are skirting the issue and have said, in many cases, it's up to the states. How credible is that claim? Now, stepping back from the legislation that's up for voting in November, there is a wider issue, which is the moral fight over abortion. And how is that unfolding? Now, cards on the table, Ben and I are both pro-abortion. Now, if you're not, I want you to stay and listen to this argument and hear a distinctive perspective on it so that you'll be aware of that. And maybe you have a disagreement, but we'd love to hear from you as well. And we're going to talk about how this perspective on pro-abortion, the defense of abortion rights, fits with the principles of the Declaration. Welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. I'm Elan Journo. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Elan.
I think the place to start is why is abortion such a big issue now, and what do you think is at stake here for Americans?
Well, you can guess just from the standard rhetoric that is associated with this controversy. You put it as we're pro-abortion and pro-abortion rights, and I think that is the most straightforward way to put it. But the way it's usually described is pro-choice, and lately there's been a lot of rhetoric about freedom in relation to abortion rights, reproductive freedom. And while I don't think that is the most straightforward way of naming the issue, it does point to the core principle that's at stake here, and it's a core American principle, the principle of individual freedom. That has been a long cherished principle in the United States, and the people who advocate for abortion rights on the basis of individual freedom are not making it up. Like the woman has an individual right to use her body as she chooses, and if you think carefully enough about the issue and about the controversy and about the principles at stake, you realize the embryo simply does not. And so if you understand the real meaning of the concept of individual rights, and if you understand where it comes from, what it's for, you will realize it has straightforward implications for the abortion controversy.
So Ben, let's dive into this position that you've staked out in many articles and in the book, Why the Right to Abortion is Sacrosanct. And I think the best way I understand this is that this is deeply influenced by Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. So maybe you could tell us a bit about her position and how that shapes your view of this.
Yes. So for anyone who's not aware, Ayn Rand was a vocal and intransigent supporter of abortion rights. She admittedly understood how people could honestly disagree on the issues with regard to the later stages of pregnancy. She thought people could be honestly mistaken in opposing abortion rights in that period. But she thought that, especially if you're talking about the first trimester, there's no honest opposition to abortion rights. That anyone who's seriously opposed to it in that period has got some irrational motivation for what they're thinking. And so because of this, she actually supported full repeal of all abortion laws and basically thought that it should be legal until birth. So very radical position, and in a way that is, I think, completely consonant with her philosophy. And it's the reason that I hold the position that I hold on this, because I agree with her philosophy.
So let's unpack that a bit. So, what is the philosophical basis she has for this position?
Yes, well, so where the rubber hits the road is the idea that the only rights that are at stake in this controversy are the rights of the mother, and the embryo has no rights. Now, why is that the case? Well, I said before that if you think about and understand really what the concept of individual rights, where it comes from and what it's for, you'll understand this has to be the position. And one important clue here is that it is the concept of individual rights. And so the idea is it applies only to individuals. And what do we mean by individuals? Well, entities that are individuated from each other. And it's quite relevant to dissolving this controversy that the embryo especially is not an individual in any relevant sense. It's not individuated from the mother. It is a biological entity that is entirely physically and physiologically dependent on her. It's, of course, potentially an individual human being, but potential is not an actual and does not become an actual human being until it is born, until it becomes individuated from the mother, that is, separate from her body, able to move around on its own. And why is that the relevant sense of individuation? Well, because again, the whole concept of individual rights, and this is not just coming from Ayn Rand, this is coming from the Enlightenment tradition of that doctrine. Uh, that doctrine arises in a period when there are tyrants who are seeking to oppress uh, citizens, and there's a growing awareness in the Western mind that adult individual human beings are autonomous agents with minds that they need to be left free to govern their lives. We need to have rights so that we can engage in the full range of action that we need if we're to use our minds to live in a social context. That is, in a situation where there are other people who could use force against us to interfere with our lives. It's possible for us to go our separate ways because we are metaphysically individual, metaphysically separate from each other, even though we're living in a society. And so there's a need to keep separate the entities that are born separate. That's part of what it means to be born free. And so that is a concept that applies first, foremost, and paradigmatically to adult individuals who are living separately in society. Now, that doesn't mean it's only grown adults that get rights. You can of course extend the concept of individual rights to cover young children, even infants. But when you get to the point of talking about embryos that are physically and physiologically attached to an already distinct individual who cannot even act, let alone use their minds to survive, that's where you've extended the concept too far, where now to extend it to the embryo, you would have to, in effect, take away the rights of the actual individual. And so that's where you've gone too far, where the concept just can't possibly apply, where it undermines the whole purpose of the concept. That's why, if you understand the concept of individual rights, you know that only the woman can have individual rights, the embryo can't. But if you want to take a step back from just the question of political philosophy, the broader philosophical reason why Ayn Rand is in favor of abortion rights and opposed to the so-called pro-life movement, which she, of course, thought was not pro-life, it's because she was an unabashed, uncompromised advocate of rationality. And if you look at any of the serious arguments that are ever given opposed to abortion rights, ultimately they bottom out in some kind of religious mysticism. And of course, she was a critic of religion. She was an opponent of mystical faith, thought all of our knowledge comes only from reason, from observation, reason based on observation. And it's true that there's a few people out there who are atheists who are still opposed to abortion rights, but if you pull apart their reasoning carefully enough, you realize they've got a kind of rationalistic grasp of the concept. They've got a floating what she would have called a floating concept of the concept of rights, which they've absorbed not from their own understanding of that concept where it comes from in reality, but they've absorbed a certain understanding they've gotten from the religious culture around them.
Can I ask you about that? So one of the positions we hear a lot about, and it's the one that's behind the so-called heartbeat laws, and that is that it's seen as soon as a heartbeat or some cardiac activity is detected, that then is the trigger for treating the embryo as possessing rights. How do you see that as folding under that argument you're saying that this is not the right way to extend the concept?
Yeah, well, very simply, there's much more to human life than a heartbeat. Heartbeat is what we have in common with animals, with birds and cows, and take any kind of animal that most people who are against abortion rights don't have any problem with killing. They probably, unless they're an animal rights advocate, they all have a heartbeat. And so that is not what makes human life distinctive. That's not what we think is, if we believe in the doctrine of individual rights, it's not what we think has anything to do with the kind of dignity that a human being that makes them worthy of the protection of rights. Human life is a very distinctive form of life. It's a life that consists in the pursuit of very distinctive kinds of both material and spiritual values. It's why, for example, a brain dead patient who's hooked up to a heart-lung machine is dead, and nobody seriously disputes that you would be wrong to unplug them from that machine. And that's even though they've got a heartbeat, and that's even though they've got human DNA. A human corpse has human DNA as well. That doesn't make it alive. And so what it is to be human, what it is to have a human life, is to be able to pursue certain kinds of values. And that presupposes an ability to act autonomously. And that is something that neither an embryo nor a fetus has.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll come back to this because I think there's something about the kinds of abortion bans that are predicated on heartbeats. I think there's something, in my view, dishonest about them. So let's dive into the political context now and talk a bit about the background. So why there is such chaos around the issue of abortion right now, and it goes back to the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the decision of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization that came out in 2022. Maybe you can just sketch for us what was the decision, how do you understand the decision in Dobbs, and what are the consequences of it, and how does that put us where we are right now?
Right. So, long story short is that the Dobbs decision found there is no right to abortion protected by the Constitution. And of course, it's true that the word abortion is not mentioned in the Constitution, and there were no laws contemporaneous with the Constitutional Convention protecting such a right. Of course, the question that should come up in light of the conversation we've already had is, well, but what about the right to liberty, the right to act autonomously, the right to make decisions about your own life, including your own body? Doesn't the Constitution protect that? And certainly it does. At least it does verbally. The Dobbs decision argued that the right to liberty is too capacious, to use their own language, which means vague, all-encompassing, hard to pin down the meaning of. Too capacious to support a right to something as specific as a right to abortion, which I find is a really ridiculous argument. For one thing, it would mean then that we don't have the right to choose through our right to liberty any specific activity that wasn't at some point enumerated in founding documents, which would empty the concept of liberty of any meaning. Of course, liberty is a capacious concept. It's the idea that you have the right to choose all kinds of things about your life. And unless someone can anticipate all the situations you'll be in and all the choices you might make, they'll, of course, not be able to specify what goes into that. But that's the whole idea. That's the whole reason that we need liberty, is that nobody can predict everything that every person's going to live, and nobody can actually make the decisions you need to make for your life. Nobody can do your thinking for you. You need liberty precisely because you are the only one who can live your life. And so there's a serious problem with the jurisprudence that I think went into the thinking, went into the Dobbs decision. Our colleague Ankar Ghate, I think, did a really excellent lecture on this topic, on this issue 2 years ago at OCON, on the problematic jurisprudence here. And it comes out of a whole erosion of the power of liberty rights in the thinking of the Supreme Court over decades, probably going back to the Lochner decision. And it's interesting because Lochner was originally it wasn't the decision, it was the dissent by Holmes, where he said, no, we can't protect a capacious right to liberty that would allow us to protect contract rights. This was at one point a left-wing position used to argue against contract rights. Now it's been adopted by the right, by the many so-called originalist interpreters on the current Supreme Court. So it's a very negative, unfortunate trend in current jurisprudence.
So I want to ask you a bit about the way abortion's come up in the last 6 months or so in the campaign. Not surprisingly, the Democrats are saying, therefore, abortion rights is part of their agenda, and they're being really vocal on that, both in presidential and local elections. The Republican position, I think, has evolved, and maybe that's a charitable way to put it. So it was taking pride in the fact that the Supreme Court had removed Roe v. Wade, overturned it, and that was something that was seen as a credit to the Trump administration, who had put in new justices during his term. But now there's been a pivot away from that. This is a topic that I really want to talk about, and in fact, the way I think the position is, it's up to the states. Let the states figure it out. So help us understand why we are here.
I mean, I think the simple reason that the Democrats are doubling down on this and that the Republicans are trying to evade what is in fact their own position is that polling regularly reveals that Roe v. Wade was a very popular decision, that it had majority support all over America. Most Americans, in fact, believe in abortion rights, at least if we're talking about the first two trimesters. And something's true even in red states. Polling regularly reveals in most red states that there's similar support for Roe. Certainly the case in Texas, where I think if it were put up to a vote, Roe would win. And when you look at the kind of language that has been successful in certain state level initiatives, like in Kansas, where red states have voted for abortion rights, it's pro-America, pro-individual freedom rhetoric. And so I think on some level, they're not usually able to back it up with sophisticated philosophical arguments, but I think on some level, most Americans get the kinds of things I've been talking about. They get that this is a core individual freedom issue. And Republicans pretend to be about individual freedom on smaller and smaller range of issues, but I think they don't want to talk about it because they know that they would look like hypocrites, and they know that it would not gel with the actual pro-freedom attitude of ordinary Americans.
So I want to understand your assessment of this idea that many Republicans are saying it needs to be left up to the states. And what does that really look like, and how do you think of that?
Well, I think it's a convenient kind of dodge. It's what's really happening is that they've been catering to religious pressure groups. They don't want to admit to that. But the sign that something like this is true and that they don't really want it to be left up to the states is that in the cases where it is being left up to the states, where in various red states where after Roe was overturned, there were then efforts to pass anti-abortion legislation or to put old anti-abortion laws back on the books. When there were then attempts to change those, there was active resistance. So, for example, in Florida, there is there is a ballot question on that's going to actually now be on the ballot in November. But when it was originally proposed, the Florida Attorney General sued to challenge the ballot question on the ground that it was using vague language. Now, leave aside that the vague language is directly proportionate to the vague language in the opposing current law, and you need something like that to repeal the opposing current law and to bring it back to Roe. The vague language is about how they want to make it legal until viability. Viability is vague, that's true, but that's the way Roe was. So they're simply trying to return it to Roe. They don't want the people to be able to vote on it. And even though that is what they nominally appeal to when they talk about the importance of returning it to the states. That's certainly what the Supreme Court talks about when it says this is an issue that should be determined by the states. They talk about the will of the majority, the will of the electorate, et cetera. Another example of the same thing, I think, is here in Texas, where, again, I point out polling regularly reveals that over 50% of Texans support returning the state to the status quo ante of Roe v. Wade, where the current laws outlaw abortion from conception, with a few small exceptions. And so there's very good reason to think that if we're put to a vote, those current laws would be immediately overturned. But because in Texas, for something to be put on a ballot measure, it has to first be approved by the legislature. The legislature has not approved it. And I don't think they will, as long as the Republicans are in control, because they know that it would lose, and they know that Democrats would come in on the coattails of that referendum, and they would lose some power. So the Republicans, I think, only care about leaving it up to the state to the extent that they can control what happens in those states, not because they actually care about the opinion of the voters.
Let's turn to the idea that you hear from Democratic voices, liberal voices, about codifying Roe. So going back to what Roe protected, putting it into law in some way. How do you think of that? Are you hopeful about this?
I'm not, and that's part of the reason why I think it's important to talk about what's happening at the states. It's just not realistic. Even if the Democrats were to win the presidency, were to win majority in both houses, I seriously doubt that they would ever be able to codify Roe. First, because it's questionable they could ever get a big enough majority. They need to have enough votes to override a filibuster, and it would certainly be something that the Republicans would filibuster. And even if they could somehow do that, it's very unlikely to me that such a law would pass muster at the Supreme Court. The whole reason that the Supreme Court overturned Roe was because, in effect, they don't think this kind of question is one that belongs to the federal government to legislate. They think that it's something that the states should do. The only precedent for a kind of national level imposition of a right not previously specified in obvious terms in the Constitution was Brown v. Board of Education. That came about because of a long history of strife and activism and civil rights era South. I don't think there's anything comparable to that would allow the Supreme Court to give it a pass. So I think that, the only thing Democrats could do at this point is to approve judges that would replace the current anti-abortion judges on the Supreme Court bench. Conceivably, they could do that, but that's very long term to get to their majority. So I think realistically, Roe v. Wade is dead at the federal level. It's not going to happen. It's not going to be re-implemented. I don't think. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think it'll be re-implemented anytime soon. And so I think this is, in effect, now a state issue.
So what do you think of the arguments that are being put forward in defense of abortion rights these days, and particularly from Democrats? How effective do you think these are? And part of the reason I'm asking is that I know in some of your work, you try to reach out to people who are on the right side of the issue. They want to see the right to abortion defended. And you're trying to give them some material, some arguments. What do you think is the current state of thinking on that side of things?
Yeah, it's not very good. The At least if what we're talking about is the ordinary rhetoric coming from mainstream Democratic politicians, the ones who care to even talk about this issue. Uh, when Kamala Harris talks about it, she normally invokes the language of trusting women, which I think is a cop out. It's, if it doesn't address the main question on people's minds about if there's a controversy about abortion, it's not because their estimate of the character of the women who are going to get it. Usually, it's they think that abortion's murder, and so even if women are as trustworthy as they could be, the question of whether you can trust them is kind of irrelevant to whether or not they should be trusted to murder people. So you have to address that issue on some level. You have to talk about why not only should you trust women, but women have rights, and you have to say something about why they have rights, and about why tiny little embryos that are sometimes indistinguishable from a dot on a page, why they don't have rights, and why that's not the kind of entity that the concept of rights was ever devised to cover. So it's very unsophisticated, the discourse about this. Sometimes I think even worse, the Democratic activists will put it as abortion is healthcare. Well, in some way, that's correct. But of course, if you think about the way Democrats and the left more generally understand healthcare, they think of it under the heading of a kind of right to healthcare as a welfare right. And that's, of course, then totally counterproductive, because what you really need to defend this idea on a moral level is you need to invoke the concept of individual rights, which are quite at odds with welfare rights. You need to defend it as this is the right of an autonomous being who needs to make decisions to live her own life, not, well, she can't live life on her own and she needs to have somebody else provide for her. If that's your standard, maybe she shouldn't get an abortion, because then shouldn't somebody provide for the fetus? So it's a horrible way to try to defend it, and it's no surprise that it hasn't had a lot of traction changing any minds. It's really just something that turns on the activist leftist base. There was a little bit of talk about freedom at the Democratic National Convention, but as far as I understood, and we did a previous podcast analyzing the platform at that convention, they were using freedom in a kind of package deal way, where it's individual freedom packaged together with welfare rights, and so really trying to water down or eviscerate the meaning of that concept. It's important to pay attention to, because I think abortion is really one of the only issues left today. The other is free speech, where the controversy is still litigated in terms of the concept of rights. And that concept has been slipping away from our discourse for so many decades now that and this is one of the reasons why I'm motivated on this issue. Is it is one of the few issues where you can still talk about a right and defending the position by reference to an individual right. And so it's a really important issue to stake out a definite position on, especially when Democrats, who are the only ones otherwise defending it, have otherwise abandoned the language and the concept of individual rights. So it's very important somebody else brings this back.
I have a lot of other questions I want to ask you. Let's talk a bit about the state level referenda. So there's ballot measures in different states. I think up to 10 different places are doing that. 5 of them will are where abortion rights are, if not completely outlawed, essentially outlawed, because I think a 6-week ban is essentially an outlawing of most abortions. And the measures there would overturn. I think Florida is a good example, where there's a so-called heartbeat law, and there's a provision to amend the Constitution of Florida to put the right to abortion back on the table. Maybe you could give us a bit of context. What do you think some of these are trying to do? Which ones do you have more, do you think are more promising? What's your overall take on these?
Yeah, so of the 10 states, as you mentioned, some of them are blue states, some of them are red states. In the blue states, where there's, of course, obviously already a lot of support for abortion rights, the ballot initiatives are generally trying to seek and protect the most extensive possible abortion rights. So, for example, Maryland, the text of the amendment it confirms an individual's fundamental right to an individual's own reproductive liberty. Sounds pretty good. Colorado puts it as government shall not deny, impede, or discriminate against the exercise of that right, including prohibiting health insurance coverage for abortion. So there, in these cases, of course, there's not much danger that the government is going to try to make any of these prohibitions. So I think these are largely symbolic measures. It's where there's something really interesting happening is in the red states, where most of them, have repealed abortion rights or severely restricted them, and so the effort of the ballot initiative is more or less to try to codify Roe at the state level, which means protecting abortion at least up to the point of viability. Now, I think viability is a completely vague concept, and that was one of the major flaws of the Roe decision. But at least from where I stand, uh, some progress is better than none. I think it would be great if these abortion ballot initiatives succeeded. One example, especially, is in Florida, where they are seeking the following. They're saying no law shall prohibit, penalize, delay, or restrict abortion before viability or when necessary to protect the patient's health as determined by the patient's healthcare provider. And there are similar measures in a number of other states, Montana, Nebraska, Missouri, and one that I'm forgetting, Arizona.
I want to talk more about the Florida case because we've been working on a piece regarding this, and I was reading about the backstory. A number of things are really surprising about what is going on in Florida. Number one is the kind of ban, which I mentioned, is sort of so-called heartbeat ban. I want to dig into that a bit, and also just some of the fallout from the efforts to tell people about this ballot initiative or amendment. And I think that there's real, it's revealing what's happened there. So one, just I want to get your perspective on. So my impression of these 6-week heartbeat bans is they're fundamentally dishonest because in most cases it's really unusual for the woman to be able to know that she's pregnant at 6 weeks. It's very hard to do that. And so I think my impression is that in effect they're bans, but they want to look like they're not. And there's some sort of concern for the woman's well-being to the point where, yeah, if you can figure it out in 6 weeks, good for you. You can go and take care of it. So there's that kind of dishonesty. And I think the other kind of dishonesty is what are doctors supposed to do? What if it's harder? I don't know exactly the science behind it, but can you actually pinpoint, is this 6 weeks? Is this 5.5 weeks? And where are you on that? And is someone going to come after you if you're a doctor and challenge that it was under 6 weeks? So there's a lot in these that just doesn't add up as a serious attempt to leave open this freedom. So I'm interested in your impressions of these sorts of bans, and then maybe there's more to say about the Florida amendment.
Yeah, I think the Florida amendment is good representative of many of the other ballot questions. And there are interesting things to say about both the critics of the amendment and of its supporters. About the critics, as you might expect, they and this was the reason that the Attorney General filed suit, more or less. They think it's too expansive. They think viability is vague. They also take issue with the language about whenever it's necessary to protect the patient's health as determined by the patient's healthcare provider. They're upset that it doesn't exclude psychological health. As the current law on the books does. The law says you can get one if you're facing a health emergency, threat to your life, but not if it's just psychological health. And as far as I'm concerned, the absence of exclusion for psychological health is a feature, not a bug. That's exactly the way it should be. Not just because like psychological health is a real thing, and people who are clinically depressed about these kinds of things sometimes do terrible things to themselves, but because, uh, as we'll talk more, health is an expansive concept, as is life, and we'll come back to that. It's also interesting to look, though, at the way that this measure has been defended by the pro-abortion rights side of the campaign. If you look at the ads that have been running on Florida TV, uh, most of them are uh, drawing attention to the various kinds of health emergencies that women have faced, usually pregnant women, when they've not been able to get an abortion, when they needed one, they knew they were going to miscarry, uh, and there have been documented cases of this all over the country. Now, I'm disappointed that this is the focus, not because I think it's irrelevant, but because I think it's not the fundamental. It certainly is relevant. If even just one woman dies because of these godforsaken bans, that is too many, and more than one already has, and the blood of these women is on the hands of the Republicans who passed these laws. And so it should be it is a fair point of commentary and should definitely be part of the conversation. My point is just that it should not be so overwhelming and dominant a part of the conversation, because uh, it's not just about women who face immediate health emergencies. It's also about women who have early term abortions where there's no immediate threat to their health, but simply because they did not want to have a child at this point in their life. Maybe they wanted to have one eventually. Maybe they didn't want to have one at all. But the point is, it is not part of their current life plan. And my point is that a law that forces a woman to go into labor, and that is what anti-abortion laws are, despite the evasive counter arguments to the contrary of certain commentators. A law that forces you into labor is fundamentally negating your life. It is negating your life plans, because, as we talked about before, there's a lot more to life than a heartbeat. And just the fact that maybe there are certain situations where your life is so in threat that you can get an abortion, in those cases you can preserve your heartbeat, that doesn't mean the law protects your life. Life is not just not being dead. It is about positive pursuit of values. And unfortunately, they would have to get a 60% majority in Florida for this thing to actually make it onto the Constitution. So even though a majority of Floridians support abortion rights, it's going to be pretty surprising if they get to 60%. So this is one reason why I think they need to be having a conversation about ordinary abortions, about the large number of women whose lives are interfered with because of the current laws, not just the small number who have to face health emergencies. They matter too, obviously, but if this is really a question about individual rights and about the right to make choices to pursue your happiness, abortion rights are not just about a kind of convenience. They're about the ability to fundamentally plan and control your life. And the voices of all the women whose lives are interfered with by these laws, they need to be part of this conversation too. And I fear that they're not giving them enough of a voice, and that's part of the reason why they might not get to the 60% they need.
I just want a reflection on that, Ben. So the so-called pro-life side, the anti-abortion side, they will often talk about the cheapening of life by having abortions. But my view is the reverse, is that they're cheapening the life of the woman by telling her that her plans and her values and what she's seeking isn't important, and that only if she's on the brink of death, only if she can show that the pregnancy was the source of some sexual assault or incest or something like that, then she has the right to decide what to do with her body, but only then. And so any other circumstance, that doesn't matter. And if there's ever a cheapening of human life, I think that actually qualifies, not what they say about abortion.
Yeah, like I I said before, life is not just the absence of death, especially if we're talking about human life, which is about active pursuit of material and spiritual values. All forms of the pursuit of happiness. That's what human life is about. And what anti-abortion laws do, in effect, is treat women as broodmares. It is severely dehumanizing. And Ayn Rand, in her essay of Living Death, which is an appropriate title for talking about the state into which these laws want to put women, noted that while the opponents of abortion rights are often religious and the types who think of themselves as concerned with matters of the spirit and the dignity of the human soul, it is perhaps not ironic that when they apply their views to the question of abortion and to sex generally, they have an intensely materialistic view of what human life is about, that you're only alive if your heart is beating and you are successfully reproducing. It doesn't matter that your hopes and your dreams have been shackled, your life has been put on hold. No, you still count as alive if you've got a pulse and you can be barefoot and pregnant. That's a wholly materialistic view of life. It's one that robs sex of the highly intense spiritual value that it has in human relationships, not because it enables reproduction, but because it's an expression of love. And so I have very, very low view of the religious opposition to abortion. I think, especially when that's the stated motive, this is why there can't be honest opposition to it. There's nothing honest about those kinds of motives.
So let's pivot to moving forward, Ben. What do you think it's going to take for positive change to happen, state level, maybe?
Yeah, it's again important. I think this is now totally a game on the state level. And in many cases, all that it'll take to change is a simple vote of the public. I mentioned before, lots of these red states, majorities still support Roe, and this was dramatized, dramatically in votes that they had in Kansas and Ohio. Kansas is a traditional red state, and they voted, I think, a year and a half ago to protect abortion rights, and there was a very wide majority that voted for it. In the state that's a red state, that's a lot of Republicans voting for it. So that's something that's possible, and some of these states coming up in November, I think we'll see the same thing. It's possible where usually you can petition to have a ballot question placed on the ballot. It's not as easy in states where it's not as easy to put something on the ballot. It's, for example, in Texas, where the state legislature has to approve it. And there, I think, for change to happen, that there has to be a change to the state legislature. It can't be. It won't work if it's a majority Republican or a majority current type of Republican. One of two things is going to happen, I think, or at least ought to happen. That as the consequences of these laws becomes clearer, as it becomes clearer that more and more pregnant women are suffering terrible, devastating health consequences, like what happened to Amanda Zurofsky here in Austin, their stories will become publicized, and also more and more doctors will not want to be a party to this. If you're an OBGYN and you want to provide adequate prenatal health care to a woman, that you have to be able to give abortions in certain kinds of situations, and these doctors are going to leave the states where these laws are on the books. They're already doing it. It's already making it harder and harder to get decent pregnancy care. So especially a state like Texas that's trying to become a competitive, high-tech economic center, they're not going to be able to attract creative talent with this kind of medieval law. And so I think one of two things will have to happen. Either Democrats will win more seats in the state legislature, or more Republicans will come to their senses and realize that this is a losing position, not just losing on the ballot, but losing for their state, losing for the lives of their citizens. And the Republicans will moderate on this question. If neither of those things happen and the laws stay on the books, um, states like Texas they will lose out, and their citizens will lose, and the lives of people we love will be lost.
Ben, I want to clarify one thing and then ask you a follow-up question. You made the point, and tell me if I'm capturing it correctly, that there's no honest opposition to abortion as a right. And one, is that your view of all the people who are opposed to abortion, or is it that's the position you have with respect to ideological advocates and people who are really pushing this? Because the natural question is, what about people who are not decided or on the fence, or feel very torn about this, and how would you approach them? Presumably if they're on the fence, they're open to hearing a different position. So how do you think of that? What's the landscape there?
Yeah, again, the point about dishonest opposition is primarily a point about people who are opposed to abortion in the first trimester, which is where it really matters. It's where any woman at least has a fighting chance to end her pregnancy if she needs to. Um, and it's in that case where it's only these kind of religious motives could possibly prompt you to oppose it. Like I said, Ayn Rand thought there could be honest disagreement about the last trimester. I think she still supported abortion rights even in the last trimester. But there where the fetus is fully formed, it really looks like a human being. And you could understand why somebody would understandably, feel queasy about that. And I mean, I think everybody rightly does feel queasy about it, even though it's sometimes necessary. So the point is primarily about these ideological opposition to it at a time where nothing other than an irrational ideology could persuade you to be opposed to it. And yeah, there are probably some people who oppose it, not because they've thought through the ideological issues, but because it's become a tribal issue. It's a sign of tribal identity, where they're maybe they're not particularly religious, but they know the other side is in favor of abortion rights, and they want to own the libs or whatever. They want to stick it to the Democrats, and so they'll oppose whatever the Democrats want. And that's maybe not ideological, but if anything, it's worse. I think it's that kind of tribalism, that kind of mindless tribalism, where you're not even thinking about the issue, but you're just going along with the crowd. That's even worse. And yeah, there are people who are honestly undecided about the issue just because they haven't thought about it, and it's for that sector of people where I think you have to think about what is the crucial concept to get to try to clarify them on. And there, I think the concept is the value of individual freedom and the value of the pursuit of happiness. These are core American values that appeal to so many ordinary Americans on many different levels. And we know that when you put campaign language in those terms, like what happened in the campaign in Kansas, it actually persuades them. It persuades them to vote for individual rights and for abortion rights. And it's a good thing that it does. It speaks very well of Americans, that does persuade them. And so, I make it my mission to make this the focus of my argumentation, is getting really clear on what the concept, the doctrine, the tradition, the American and Enlightenment tradition of individual rights is all about. I did a talk at Ocon this past summer on the revolutionary secular concept of individual rights. That'll be up on YouTube pretty soon. That digs deep into the history of the concept and shows, why it applies paradigmatically to adult thinking human beings, definitely not to subhuman entities. So that's why I make that my focus. And I think it's also just this is an issue that connects with so many different aspects of Ayn Rand's philosophy. You can see every major branch of her philosophy at work in her position on abortion. It's what makes her position so distinctive, and it really helps show what's so distinctive about her philosophy as a whole.
So you mentioned your talk from the summer conference is going up online. So let me mention a couple of other resources as we wrap up here. One is the Ayn Rand lexicon, which you can find on our website. And there's an entry on abortion, which will take you to her writings on that. And particularly the excerpts there are, I think, just highly relevant sections. And then you can read the whole article to get the fuller story. And the other resource I will mention is the book that you put together, Ben, Why the Right to Abortion is Sacrosanct, which people can find on Amazon, and much of the content is available on the web at our website. And you can see the link there. We'll put that in the
And
show notes. So thanks.
I
Yeah.
could say just about that book, there's a chapter in there, which you can also find separately online, Ayn Rand's Radical Case for Abortion Rights. And one thing that it does is take not just the material in the lexicon entry, but other material that she wrote, and really, I think, demonstrates without a doubt that she did, in fact, have a radical position on this question. And some people argue that she was opposed to abortion rights in later trimester, and it's just not true. The evidence doesn't support that. This lays out all the evidence and makes fully clear what her full position was.
Good. And I encourage people to take a look at that book. And today, thanks, Ben, for this perspective on where abortion is in our culture. And let's hope that better arguments prevail.